Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. Now on this episode, I'm breaking ground in two different ways. The first is that rather than having one guest, I've got two. And the second is that I want to start inviting other podcasters, those who deal in behavioural science or risk-related topics, onto the show so that we can learn from their experiences. After all, if you've spent a lot of time talking to other people about a topic, you probably know something. And on this particular show, I've invited two people who are the co-hosts of one of my favourite podcasts. The Behavioural Grooves podcast takes an irreverent look at behavioural science-related topics with, as we'll come on to explore, a little bit of a musical twist. And Kurt Nelson and Tim Houlihan have been presenting that for over 100 episodes. So for that reason alone, they're worth speaking to as behavioural science experts in their own right. But they're also behavioural science practitioners. They work with companies looking at the areas of motivation and reward. And I thought as I explore human risk, one of the important functions within organisations is human resources. The clue, after all, is in the name. And so as we think about mitigating human risk, one of the important things is to understand the processes that are controlled by HR and to explore how those might be improved in the service of mitigating human risk. So do sit back and enjoy what was a fabulously entertaining conversation to record with Kurt Nelson and Tim Houlihan of the Behavioural Grooves podcast. So I am delighted that the first in my series of bringing other podcasters in includes two of my favourite podcasters whatsoever. Kurt Nelson and Tim Houlihan, hosts of the Behavioural Groove podcast. Welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you. We are excited to be here.
We are. Thank you so much, Christian.
It's a real pleasure to have it. And you were, as I was saying to you as we were speaking before, you were my kind of gateway drug into behavioral science as I started to realize that was a topic I was interested in. And so I'm kind of fascinated what got you guys into it and what prompted the interest in behavioral science from both of you.
So what was our cigarettes that led to the marijuana that then led to the heroin? Yeah, our gateway drink. So for me, this is Kurt. I have always had a fascination with human motivation, and the work that I've done for the past 30 years has ultimately led me to that. And so as we started to understand why people are doing what they're doing, that was the work around building incentives and working through companies about how to motivate their teams and how to motivate employees. It led naturally to behavioral science, which led me then to go beyond my MBA and dig into a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology, which is, as I like to say it, it's the psychology for normal people, not people who have something that's wrong. And there's obviously great work being done in the clinical and that type of psychology, but this is psychology around work and positive psychology and things that people are doing. And so I just fell in love with all of that and all of the research that goes along with it. So that's my story, Tim.
So this is Tim Houlihan's voice, and my gateway was in college when I had microecon back-to-back with consumer behavior. And that started this dichotomy, this pressure between the rational agents in economics and the irrational agents as consumers. And I thought that didn't make sense, but it didn't materialize until 20 years ago when I started working in the incentive industry, ironically at the same company that Kurt worked at. And that's what propelled me down all the rabbit holes, was incentives, motivation. Why do people do what they do? And that led me to all kinds of research applications with people like Dan Ariely, and doing projects with George Lowenstein and at Carnegie Mellon and other university professors. That's really how that's been my path so far.
And, look, one of the things I will tell anybody that if you want to look at human risk, compliance and risk is where it's at. But the more I look at this space, the more I see HR and the processes that they control as being absolutely critical to determining behavior, culture, and a whole host of things that we probably don't think about too much, but are critically important in the way that organizations operate. And I know that you've both done a lot of work around sort of sales incentives and general incentivization of staff. I mean, how do you see that? How do you bring behavioral science into that space?
Well, let's start with just a very basic thing that we want to keep people safe in the workplace because it's going to be really hard to engage an employee that's dead. Right. So we've got to start by keeping people safe.
This is why they pay you the big bucks for these insights,
exactly.
Right?
Well, Tim, you being dead or alive doesn't really, it's about the same.
That's right. There's no material difference for me. But we know that HR cares, as we've looked at HR organizations throughout many, many enterprises around the world. HR cares a great deal about people, and it's really about finding the right policies to drive the right, to shape the right behaviors, to shape the right culture for the behaviors that they're looking to support. Safety doesn't come just from a bunch of rules; it ultimately comes from culture. Kurt, what thoughts do you have about that?
Well, safety and human risk all lead back to us as humans. And I think the interesting piece is that whatever rules and compliances you have in there, whatever systems and processes you have in there, ultimately it's the humans at the end of that system or process that are the ones that are actually doing the things that are either keeping them safe or putting themselves at risk or putting the organization at risk. And so you have to understand, what are those motivations that are driving people? And we, as Tim mentioned earlier, this idea that humans are rational actors is the idea. It came from economics. It came from classical economics, that we try to optimize our utility or well-being, whatever you want to call it. And we do that in a very rational way where we search out information, we analyze that information, we do pros and cons, and then we make the choice that gives us the best optimal outcome. But that's not how we work. That is not how we work. We work because we're humans and we're emotional creatures, and I have a gut feeling about something, or I don't like you, or I don't like how, the shirt that you're wearing, so I'm going to go against whatever you say. And so what I think human resources and even compliance, and I think what you're doing, Christian, is really taking some of this insights from behavioral science and saying, hey, we have to understand the human side of things, the emotional side of things, because that's really where the rubber hits the road. And if you can do that, that's the positive aspect of that.
As well as the context that these things are happening in.
As always, context is vital.
Yeah.
But it's kind of interesting, right? Because if you look at HR as a function, I mean, it's got the word human in the title. And so you would presume, being logical, right, that this stuff would be totally understood and that you would have a function. If any function in the organization is going to understand people, it's the one with the word human in it. And yet I've seen so many examples, and I know you guys have, of sort of a complete lack of understanding of that thing, leading to some really bad outcomes. And I'm perplexed as to why that is. Yeah.
So you nailed it. We presume because there's human in human resources that they should be the experts. And I have seen
even
some.
Just know something, right?
Yes, yes.
I mean, you're setting the bar super high, which I respect. But if we kind of, even if we set the bar low and sort of have an appreciation of as our target, we still fall short in many organizations. I mean, we've all worked in places where the HR function is suboptimal, to put it politely.
Right. Yeah. And I think you nailed it there. There's a key piece here, which is this idea that human resources is really trying to understand the human side of it as opposed to the resources side of it. And so when we think about what human resources do in those suboptimal people that we've seen or interactions that we've had, it's all about, did you check this list? Did we do this assessment? Did we follow these procedures and policies and put in place? And those are the rabbit holes that, human resources goes down, as opposed to sitting there and thinking about how is the human part of this really taking shape? How are our actions impacting what they're thinking? And I think that shift is coming. I think behavioral science behavioral economics in particular, has been a big instigator in that. But it's still lacking, and it's still lacking a lot.
Yeah, if I could add to that, in defense of HR, I think that they're dealing with legacy policies and legacy procedures in a very quickly changing world, and so it's hard. Again, that's just about as far as I want to defend them. To prosecute them,
you're doing a great job, by the way. It's compelling stuff so far. I think you're going to run out of road pretty soon. But
they still have these Jurassic policies, and this is problematic that they're not adapting, and they're really not embracing behavioral science specifically as a way to really build on what we know about people, because I don't think that they're paying enough attention to the people. Still, so many HR departments that Kurt and I see, they're still primarily defending the company more than they are really focused on the people that work there.
Well, and part of that is because they're being brought in by the managers and the leaders inside the companies for specific actions, either around terminations, often around disciplinary actions, often on promotions and various different things. But they're brought in at certain points. They're not dealing with those people on a day in and day out basis, which is where you learn about the human side of people. And so to do that, to go in, to come out, to go in, to come out, you're just putting things in place from a procedural perspective. And if that procedural perspective doesn't have that human emotional side of things, it can be Jurassic, as Tim mentioned.
But it's strange, right? Because if you were running, I don't know, an aquarium or a zoo, you would study how these creatures operated. You would understand the patterns and the rhythms, and we can debate the rights or wrongs about having sort of performing animals as they do in some aquarium. But the basic principle is you understand the creatures that you are there to kind of nurture and look after. And you would think that HR functions would be doing the same thing within organizations that employ human beings.
I don't think HR organizations are being rewarded for those kinds of understandings. HR organizations, the way that leadership sets up reward systems within organizations, HR tends to get rewarded on did the level of satisfaction within the organization increase between last year's employee survey and this year's employee survey. Which is it's a blunt instrument at best. And so this is a great example of substituting a really simple question for a really difficult question, when what they really ought to be, what they end up asking is how can I improve the scores on our survey? But what they really should be asking is how can I create a culture where people thrive? And that's a harder question to answer.
And I think there's an aspect too of satisficing that goes on. So what they're doing works to a degree. So you Christian, you had mentioned this idea of studying the animals in the zoo or in the aquarium and really getting to understand them. And I think you can do that too, to a certain point. And then if you don't go any further, you don't really get at the underlying elements behind why an elephant is doing this or why a certain fish is acting a certain way. You notice that the elephant is doing something. You notice that the fish is doing something, and you go, oh, that happened. There you go. I think HR is the same way. They've gotten to a point where they go, hey, we do X, and it kind of does this Y thing over here in general. Don't really understand the reasons why, but we don't need to. And as Tim mentioned, you're not getting paid to. They're not getting rewarded to. They're not being motivated beyond their natural curiosity and natural inclinations to be able to do that. So they're satisfied. They just, it's working good enough, and that's all they need.
But it's a really interesting illustration about what motivates human beings, right? So if you are motivated, you're encouraged to look at your employee survey, and I have massive issues with employee surveys because I think they are I won't even call them an instrument; they're just blunt. And it's just, we know the biases that are inherent in those things. And I always love talking about, the kind of surveys where you get something free if you fill it in. And the objective is, free bottle of water in a hotel, or there's a free drink or something. And you kind of go, how do I get through this survey as quickly as possible to get to the prize draw or the end of the thing? Answer is I'll just tick the middle, or I'll go one way or the other. And unless I have an extreme views, I'll kind of sit. And so we know that surveys are utterly useless, and yet they rely on these things hugely to determine what they're. And it's a great example, I think, of a poor instrument, but also of incentives, the pieces that you talk about. Because if you incentivize people and say your target is to get a better survey result, they will behave in accordance. And that's basic behavioral science.
Yeah. And I did some work many, many years ago with a large car manufacturer, and they had the salespeople were rewarded. They got a bonus on top of their commission depending upon their rating. And they needed a 9 or a 10. And so at the end, what we did some work going out and looking at this. And so it wasn't that they changed how they were selling. It wasn't that they changed anything in like actual their customer service aspect, except for at the end when they had the survey, they were putting it in front of the people going, I need a 9 or a 10 because that's how I get, it will actually impact my pay. And it probably decreased customer satisfaction because you're feeling like you have to, as a customer, ship off that 9 or a 10. So there are the unintended consequences, as you said, of surveys. There are also that snapshot in time. I go into the hotel room. I've just had a crappy flight, and already pissed off. I'm gonna record you less than others. They have a number of issues, as we talked about. That being said, that blunt instrument that they are is the instrument that companies use and incent. And I think if they want to get beyond that, if HR wants to move past that, that's where they need to be thinking, as Tim said, how do we create a culture that thrives? And I think there are people out there. I think there are organizations that are doing that. I don't think it's necessarily the norm across the HR industry, but it's out there, and I think there's some shining lights. And if we look at incentives, because the more I look at, the way companies are moving in the 21st century is historically it was kind of, we will bribe you with money. Very simple. So we have a very transactional relationship with our employees, and they will turn up and they will do what we want because we're paying them. And I think we know that in the knowledge economy where there's this kind of quality development and we want people to use their brains and to adapt to changing circumstances, then this blunt instrument doesn't work. And so I'm very interested in what you're seeing in terms of innovative ways of rewarding people and sort of bringing some of the behavioral science around that into this.
There's three primary areas of rewards. First, before I answer that, let me just say one thing about incentives. When we talk about incentives, there's really two parts to an incentive. There is the rule or the way that people earn, and then there's also the reward itself. And both of those things are what make up the incentive. But there's three types of rewards that we see consistently in our research with clients getting better results than anything else. And of course, money doesn't make it into the top three. The things that are actually the most engaging when it comes to this above and beyond kind of behavior, this thinking on your feet or being willing to stay late, those kind of rewards are non-monetary in nature. So they involve travel or experiences or merchandise, and there's a lot of people that are like, oh my God, that's just so old school. But I tell you, it works. It works like magic. This stuff is absolutely very, very powerful because we have a signaling and an identity-based society, and having new stuff, especially luxurious or what the academics call hedonic luxuries, man, that's really, really powerful stuff. And it's delivers a tremendous amount of motivation. And so
Tim is talking about the reward part of that equation where he talked about there's the rules and then there's that reward element. So we've seen in case studies time in and time again, if you have a short-term incentive, so these are the 3-month, 60-day type incentive contests that are going out there, that you put that reward that is a tangible reward out there and it gets better performance than the cash equivalent. Even if it's valued at the same, $5,000 or a $5,000 value trip to Hawaii. The $5,000 value, the trip to Hawaii gets a lot bigger increase in performance. That being said, money still is important, and money comes into play in a number of ways in annual compensation, whether it be your cash incentives as a salesperson, your bonus as a worker employee, those aspects, and those have to be structured in a way that is driving the right behaviors. Going back to the rules section that Tim talked about earlier, and those rules need to be designed such that they're not driving the unintended consequences. And this is both for regardless of what the reward is, regardless of how long the incentive is put in place for. What we see is that people, again, we understand human nature, are looking for the easiest way in order to satisfy those rules. Sometimes that easy way means that they're gaming the system. And good incentives understand that. Good incentive design understands that. And so knowing that by people that there's a certain subset of the population that are going to try to game the system, how do you build in that gaming so that it's driving the right behaviors and building the right culture and all of the right things that you want it to do? Incentives go astray when organizations don't take into consideration the human dynamics of what incentives do. And to that degree, they can drive the wrong behavior because of the unintended consequences of trying to game the system, or just because the rules themselves are kind of vague, and so people are interpreting them however they are. Or they can actually be counterproductive. You can actually create incentives that backfire from a motivational perspective, because what you're doing is you're tapping into what would typically be the intrinsic motivation that you have. And if you are supplanting that with some of the extrinsic motivation, there's lots of research that points to some of that. Now, that doesn't happen as readily as some researchers, I think, claim, but there is that chance of having that happen still.
You know, if I could add to that, thank you for those clarifications, Kurt. I didn't mean to lead us astray, but I
love being led astray by you guys. Feel free.
But to add to the innovative responses or the innovative ideas, one of the things that we've seen in the last few years that we see is really powerful when it comes to just general motivation is self-selected goals. And again, if we use behavioral science well, we can frame a set of goals in such a way that give people an opportunity to think about, well, where do I want to land on this scale? How much can I improve my performance in a particular area, especially over a short period of time, in order to really make a difference? And by the way, the reward needs to be commensurate with the risk involved, right? So if there's extra effort, then there needs to be a greater reward associated with it. But self-selected goals are having a really big impact in a variety of areas. Of course, we think of incentives first, but I also did a project with a multinational oil and gas company several years ago, where they were trying to figure out how can we do a plant transition and keep everybody safe, because it's really, really, you talk about risk. This is really dangerous stuff when you're turning around a plant and you shut it down for 24 hours and you have it's very, very risky stuff. And so they broke it down into very, very discrete processes and parts. Of course, they're engineers. They were good at doing that. But then they said, let the groups that are responsible for that self-select their own goals. How are they going to do it? How are they going to make sure that they deliver on it? And then the rewards were commensurate with that.
That's fascinating. I mean, it's really obvious, right? Because I think back to school and how do teachers get kids to be interested? Something they have to kind of spark a lot, find what gets the kid interested in the topic. Mm-hmm. And we lose that after a while, because I think back to the teachers I really liked were the ones that, in fact, the ones I really respected were the ones that had a really terrible subject that was dull as you like, who turned it into, Latin, right? Of course, because I grew up in, the British school system, you have to do Latin, mm-hmm. which actually seems to carry you to the office of Prime Minister in the UK, being able to speak ancient languages. But, that was a kind of key part of the education. And for the avoidance of upsetting any of my listeners that that are fans of that, I do think it's important to understand where language comes from in history, and there is some benefit to it. But, you take a subject like that is on the face of it dull, and you had some teachers that made it really interesting. And I used to think the teachers that can make really dull subjects interesting and spark pupils' interest in that have something. And then you get the opposite, which is the teachers that have really interesting subjects that manage to ruin it. But we know that intuitively. And yet it seems astonishing that organizations are only just cottoning on to the fact that if I can spark something intrinsic in you, you'll do a much better job because you care.
Well, but the thing is we've been taught that, just throw money at it, and that's what motivates people. It is the kind of rule that permeates all of, the corporate world, where you are sitting there and saying, well, how do we motivate somebody to go above and beyond? Well, just pay them a bonus, pay them extra, and that will do it. And it is the epitome, and I hate these analogies but saying, look, if you only have a hammer, then everything is a nail, right? And it's a bad, overused kind of analogy, but it fits, because if the only way that you're looking at the world is through, the paycheck that I can give to my employees, then that's what you're going to be doing. When in fact, as you said, that teacher who can understand what it is that's going to get you excited about Latin. Oh my gosh, carpe diem, right? I'm going to seize my day here and try to figure it out. That's the only Latin I know, by the way, so that's why I threw it in. But the idea...
Apparently, Kurt didn't go to a British school.
I went
he hides it well.
I went to Iowa. There you go. It's almost as close to Britain as I can get. No, but those teachers that are able to do that, can spark that, are like the good leader inside an organization who sets a vision forward, who identifies, and we talk. Tim and I have done work with a model of motivation called the 4 Drive model, and one, it's a drive that talks about, there's a need for the extrinsic, rewards. There's this idea too that as humans we need to feel like we bond with others and that we belong. And so there's that aspect. And if you can tap into that drive, that's really powerful. There's also a need for us to feel like we're challenged and that we're learning, and that it's not I'm going into the job doing the same thing over and over and I'm just bored out of my mind. And then there's this last one, which is like this idea of purpose and being, defending this culture that I feel proud of, and this organization that I feel like I want to, stand up for if somebody's saying things. So tapping into those other 3 drives beyond the extrinsic are some of the ways that good leaders are taking, oftentimes really, as you said, hard jobs that may not have that intrinsic element built into them, and making them so that people are excited to go there. It's that intrinsic emotional side of us that really gets excited about these things.
Yeah, and by the way, that's not easy. What Kurt is describing is what really the best in class leaders are doing, and they are the best in class because they're rare. Regrettably, it takes a lot of effort to be a good leader. To be a good manager of something and to be a good leader, you have to really work hard. And I think, in general, it's a lot easier to be kind of mediocre than it is to be really good.
Yeah, I should know about that.
Tim knows a lot about being mediocre, that's for sure.
It's one of my greatest qualities.
But going back to HR, and I think that you just nailed something there, Tim. And to really take this to the next level, you do have to put in that hard work and have that spark inside of you in order to take it to the next level. And I'm not saying that there's not those people within HR, but it's much easier just to be average and just to be mediocre. And, it's work going in to apply behavioral science. You have to listen to podcasts like this and ours, and you have to read books, and you have to, go out and then apply what you learned in looking at the situation that you're in and going, how does this apply? And, taking loss aversion and saying, well, does that work here? Or is this more of a framing issue? Or is it more of a, choice architecture aspect? And so you take all of these concepts and your brain gets overloaded, and God, it's a lot easier just to sit back and do things like we've always done it.
I'm exhausted just listening to you.
I mean, and I think the experimentation piece is key. Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things I always find hilarious is people say, you understand, you the behavioral science person, you understand people, you will come with the silver bullet. And of course, if you're going into an organization where the way they do things is so terrible that you just know that anything but what they're doing is a better way of doing it, then that's nice and easy. You can kind of come in and say, I've always sort of seen organizations that threaten their employees are probably not going to get the most out of them. If your whole modus operandi is a kind of drill sergeant mentality right. when you're not in the military, maybe stop shouting at people and try and treat them like human. There it's kind of obvious. But when you get to the more sophisticated piece, and I'm guessing particularly with remuneration and reward, then it gets a lot more complicated because the drivers aren't just as simple as we might like them to be. And sometimes they're counterintuitive.
Absolutely, they are. They can be counterintuitive, but maybe more importantly, they are so culturally contextualized that you could come up with a really great plan and have it work for one part of an organization that might not work in another part of the organization, because big companies can develop these subcultures within them that can be different. What might be apparent and be really successful in a research and development area might be completely different than what you'd want to have in a sales organization.
Well, and even so, we interviewed Michael Halsworth on our show, and he talked about just using this concept of a letter that was sent out from the government, and they had done some various different things to make it more readable and easier to understand, and all of these things that simply, and it worked really good in, and forgive me, I'll mess up the city, Washington, D.C. And so then they got called in by Albuquerque, New Mexico, to do a very similar thing. And they said, well, it worked here. And so they right. put the idea together and they put it in place. And luckily what they did, because they're researchers, is they actually did some A, B, C, and D testing on this. And they sent the one out that they thought would work because it had worked in Washington, D.C. And they were kind of just like, we don't even have to think about it. And it came back that it actually failed. It actually decreased what they were trying to do. And so that aspect of contextual, the environment that it is in, and Tim was saying, this works in a research and development, and it may not work in this other area. Even within a research and development, if research development in one organization versus research and development in a different organization, the same reward, the same incentive, the same program, whether it be any type of program, is going to have a different response potentially based upon the culture and the little nuances and small things. It's that idea of the butterfly in Australia causing the hurricane in Florida.
Or the other way around.
Or the other way around, yeah. or a butterfly causing, massive bushfires down in Australia. Right. There you go. But the idea that small, even those small changes can have a significantly large effect. So in any of these types of change initiatives, anything where you're going in and you're working with humans, the dynamic of humans is such a complex piece of, this idea that we are all the same and that we can plug and play and we can just take out what we did over here and put it in this person and it's going to act the same way. It's just a fallacy. It's just this totally misconception. And so testing, understanding the nuances and how your culture works. And this is where behavioral science, we can try to inform, right? We can say, we think this is going to work better because of X, Y, and Z, because we have this background knowledge. And as you said, if the company's really doing piss poor shit, then, it's pretty easy to go in.
Is that a technical term?
Yes. And sorry if you have to bleep that out to be a PG thing. I apologize.
Well, to bring this back to risk and compliance issues, when we think about behaviors and we want people to do something that they're not doing now, we shouldn't start with, we're not better off starting with where we want them to be. We're much better off starting with where they are. What are they doing now and why? What's the context in which they're doing that in? Just start with, Kurt talked about the teachers, you as well, Christian. This whole idea of what is the current behavior? Where are people at right now? Why are they doing that? What is the culture and the context and the environment and the rewards and all the things that are going into making that behavior the least amount of friction possible in those people's minds, and then start plotting the course to get to the new behavior. But you have to really understand why they're doing what they do right now. Understanding the current behavior is critical.
Right. And I think this is we're on the cusp of, this is a really interesting sort of 21st century topic to my mind, because one, we know more than we've ever known before. So we ought to be taking this stuff and using it in, the medical profession wouldn't sit there and go back to things they were doing 2 centuries ago. You move with the times. And I think that the sort of things we're picking up there, but also if I look at what technology is coming in to do, and the introduction of AI and robotics and these pieces means that actually what people are going to be doing, and it's already happening, right, but it's going to get much, much worse, I think, is doing things that the machines can't, and therefore we need to get the most out of our human capital. And we don't do that by treating our human capital like it's a machine. Mm-hmm. We need to think about people's individual career paths and needs. And as I was struck as you were talking around the different functions within organizations, of course, the R&D function, the sort of, the pointy headed people in that space are going to be different to the salespeople, because logically those are different skill sets. And you wouldn't have somebody that was good in a laboratory going out on the road to sell, and probably vice versa. We don't want a sort of cavalier attitude in the laboratory. And I think, as we look at what we need people to do in the 21st century, this stuff starts to get really important. And so for me, I struggle to see why organizations aren't grabbing this now, because they're going to have to master it very, very quickly.
Yeah. Well, the sales team that is working in New York is going to have totally different challenges and needs to be treated differently than the sales team that's working out of the London office, that's working out of the Shanghai office. They all have the context matters so much. And yet it's so easy for the VP of sales for global sales just says, we need a big incentive. We need to sell more. And so let's just get an incentive going for everybody. You're like, what the hell? That is not going to. You got to look at the context.
Well, the interesting part, and I think Christian, you nailed this, is that this is a 21st century problem. That given the machine learning capabilities, the AI that is coming in place, given the advances in understanding human behavior and human motivation, and you start marrying those two pieces together, it can either be Shangri-La and it can be this wonderful world where we get down to personalized incentives that are designed in such a manner that I feel really engaged at work, and this is optimal for what is for me, whereas Tim is going to have a different set and you're going to have a different set, and every listener out there has a different profile about what it is that motivates them. What's scary about it on the flip side of that coin is if you get some unethical actors in there, some unethical leaders who are looking at this and saying, wow, I can use this, marrying of this machine learning and this behavioral science, so I don't have to pay my employees as much, and I can still get them to do more work, and I can actually hire people that suboptimal wage and work them hard and long and keep them there for 18 hours a day, and they're not even realizing that we're manipulating them, then that gets to be, the negative side of this. And there's this opportunity that we have right now of it can go either way. And what, scares me is that we're going to go the wrong way. But what really excites me is the possibility of being able to have the other side of that too.
I mean, we arguably already have gone the wrong way. If you look at some of the noise around social media and, elections and general influencing of people and fake news and. I mean, it's already happening, right? The sorts of behavioral intervention techniques that we're talking about here, that we think about in the context of making organizations better, are what is being deployed by some of these tech companies right now.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where you can see the divisiveness and the ability to be able to target down to almost that individual level where it's going, this message sent to Tim is going to tweak Tim into a fury that he's going to go out and, protest or get mad at this, and regardless of the actual validity of that or whatever it would be. But I understand what are the trigger points for Tim, and I understand what the trigger points are for you. And I understand, the trigger points for millions of people. I don't, but the machine does. And so we can now target very specific messages to those individuals. And you're right. It's happening today, and Lord knows, in what manner. I every time I see something that gets me upset now, I go, all right, is this real, or is somebody actually playing with me because they know, I've been entered into some algorithm that has identified that, yep, that's the piece that's going to trigger me. And it makes the world a really kind of scary place where you can't trust anything anymore. And I think, to the point that we're talking inside organizations and to make organizations better, what really scares me is that, A, they can do it on this massive scale in society and politics and other aspects. Think of the power and the information that you have of people who are working for you and the ability to be able to manipulate that. That's what scares me.
Kurt's example is really a great example of bringing a thoughtful approach to life, but that's only for the portion of the decisions and things that we're aware of during our day that are conscious to us, because so many of our decisions and so much of the processing that's happening in our brains is subconscious. So we're just not even aware of this stuff. We're not even aware of some of the biases that are most of the biases that are impacting me at any given time, because it's happening on a subconscious level. And so, but even if we take that subset of things that are conscious and that we're aware of, it's so damn hard to stop yourself and go, wait a minute, am I being manipulated here? Is it possible that the source of this content is trying to manipulate me? That amount of friction just depletes our brain cells, and we know enough about neuroscience to know that the later that it goes in the day, the more apt we are, the more susceptible we are to just go, yeah, okay, I'm just going to go along with it, because it's just too damn hard to figure out, to even ask the question.
Even if we could switch these things off, they're actually quite useful sometimes.
Yes.
And I one of the things that I sort of love in the conversations that you have, and we will come on and talk more about the podcast because I want to make sure we fully explore the genesis and what that's all about for listeners. But as the people that when you have those conversations, it is very clear that there are sort of some things that we do that are fundamentally not fit for purpose in the 21st century, right? That we're just idiots. And yet, on the other hand, and I speak definitely for myself, but
you are talking to two big idiots right here. So there you go.
Oh yes.
Right, and of course, idiocy sometimes produces humor, and I'm always I hate shutting off things that might provoke entertainment and creativity. But they're also incredibly useful. And some of the sort of heuristics that we use, the obvious ones around you couldn't process all the information you need to process to cross the road if you processed it in real time. So we have a set of shortcuts that allow us to navigate that. Useful stuff. And so I sort of, it's an interesting one where on the one hand I go, we have got to stop manipulating people. I don't want to be manipulated. On the other hand, some of these things are useful. And,
yes.
and where one draws that line, I think, is quite an interesting question around which biases serve us well, and sometimes the same bias can serve you amazingly well in one context and appallingly in another. And then what should the state be doing to influence these and stop permitting or stopping these things?
And you bring up a really good point: is that they are useful, and the heuristic that we have, the bias that we have, the way that we process information in our system one thinking versus a more thoughtful, long-term thinking, we would not be able to get through the day without those, right? There's so many stimuli coming in. We have to filter it out. We have to make decisions based on instantaneous kind of things. We wouldn't be able to drive a car. We wouldn't be able to, handle any type of heavy machinery. We would be frozen because we'd have to run through all of the different scenarios of what could or could not happen and try to pick the optimal, and it doesn't work. But what you said, I think that is really insightful, is those heuristics that serve us well in one context can serve us really poorly in another context. And so it's not just switching off that heuristic or switching on that heuristic. It is understanding how these heuristics impact us and in what situations are they useful, which situations are they not. And it goes back to this idea that Tim brought up of saying, how do we, the context of all of this stuff is so important. And yet, what do? It's like we have to understand things, but yet we can't understand them because they're operating at a subconscious level. So,
well, and this is where we are standing on the shoulders of, we're living in a world that was built by someone else. Right. I mean, we're living in this world that other people created the roads, that other people created the technology that's using us to talk, right now. We're relying on a lot of those things because we're not trying to figure out all those. We're not trying to figure out how to build a road because there's someone else who can build a road. We're not trying to figure out how to do this long distance recording because someone else has figured that out. And I think to some degree, we have to be willing to give that over to corporations to say we're going to have some degree of trust in the corpus of the organization, in having our best interests at heart. And that part, the trust is earned. It's never given, but it's always earned. So I think we have to let companies try to do a better job of getting back to compliance and risk, that we have to allow organizations to create policies that keep us safe. And when those things fail, then to change them, to try something else.
So Tim, I just have to comment. You said corpus of organization. So is that your Latin background that you're hiding?
Well, I
it sounds a Latin word. I don't know because I don't know these things, but it sounds Latin to me. So
my favorite Latin phrase is illegitime non carborundum, which is don't let the bastards grind you down.
I'm assuming you picked that up from Handmaid's Tale rather than your sideline reading. But nonetheless,
that
came from my chemistry teacher in high school, not my Latin teacher.
That's right. Yeah. But it is interesting though when you sort of think about, you say, well, we should trust people do things. So I can look at an organization, and I have a financial services background where they have a lot of data about what their employees are doing. Now, historically, banks weren't really paying attention to what individual, say, traders were doing. And so we had all sorts of situations of wrongdoing and appalling behavior. And so they've been required to start monitoring what their employees do in quite an intrusive way. And that's everything from what trading positions do you have through to what language are you using in emails. And monitoring the nature of the communications you're having to make sure they're appropriate. And on the one hand, from a risk perspective of the organization, that's exactly what they need to do, because we human beings have been demonstrated to, you put power at their fingertips, which you do with the keyboard and the systems, and they will do crazy things, particularly back to incentives if you incentivize them to do those things. And so on the one hand, that's good. On the other hand, you could say, well, that's a massive privacy issue. And banks have a real challenge in places like Germany, where the privacy laws are very strict and you're not allowed to use this data in the same way. But you could also say, well, it's quite powerful from a mental health perspective. We need to keep an eye on our people to make sure they're okay. And where's that fine line between, doing the right thing, something that we ought to expect a caring employer to do, and being incredibly intrusive and picking up a whole load of data that would allow them to identify that they should fire me ahead of somebody else because the algorithm tells them that I'm the next person who's going to do something bad. Almost like a Minority Report, the Tom Cruise movie type situation. Yeah. And that's a really tough balance.
It is a tough balance when you get into this predictive ability, right? And we are at that point with the amount of data that we have on people and the understanding of behavioral science, that we are at the point where we can predict to a certain degree actions of people. We've talked with some of our guests about the ability to know, hey, who is going to quit? We have, by understanding the amount of data that's coming in and different actions, there's algorithms that are able to predict that says, in the next 60 to 90 days, this person is probably going to leave the company. So then do you fire that person in advance of that? Or do you offer them a big incentive? All these different, responses to that understanding. But it is still a prediction. And like Minority Report, it's not 100% guaranteed. And again, we are all human, and we might be acting in a way that, indicates that we're going to be doing something, and it could be just a noise in the system that's getting picked up as a signal that really isn't a signal.
Fascinating stuff. I mean, we could keep going with this forever, but I do want to make sure that we talk about the podcast. And for any of my listeners that haven't listened to the Behavioral Grooves podcast, the only complaint I have about it is the way you spell behavioral, but we will forgive the fact that you've slashed the U from that particular piece because
we're stupid Americans, this is how we spell things over here. So,
well, to be honest, I don't understand why we have the U. So I have a sneaky suspicion you're right and we're wrong, but we can part that thing. So this is, this is a labor of love that you've created, and you're over 100 episodes, for which congratulations, because that's one heck of an achievement.
Thank you.
How did this thing come about? And I love this idea of combining behavior and music. And I know you both have a slightly different take on what the grooving aspect of the behavioral groove means.
Kurt's got the best story for starting for the creation. I think Kurt's got the best story.
Oh, so I'm just supposed to make something up now? Is that how this works? So,
I'm throwing it. in. This is a hot potato.
I got it. No, I thought you said I'm the better storyteller. So no, Tim and
that's not the case.
Tim and I have known each other for a number of years through different work interactions and various different things. And when Tim left his last job, we got together and we said, we want to do something together. And so we thought through all these things and various different things. And we actually landed on doing a meetup here. We're both based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, up in the northern tundra of America, where it's cold, 6 months out of the year, and we got snow all the time. And so we said we're going to do a meetup, and the meetup is just a local one to have people gather around to build a community that are interested in behavioral science and interested in kind of forming this idea of learning about behavioral science and its application to work. So we did that. We did the first one. And then the second one, we had a speaker coming to it. And this is a once a month deal. Get about 25, 30 people showing up to them when we first started these. And the speaker was Dr. James Heyman. Dr. James Heyman did one of the classic papers with Dan Ariely on behavioral science, the Tale of Two Markets, which is a great, if you're getting into research reads, it's a really good one. And it talks about incentives and social versus, exchange and various different things. Anyway, long story short, we realized that we're going to have 25 people being able to listen to this fantastic story. And I had just been on a radio show a couple weeks prior to this meetup happening. And it went really easy. And I thought it was really kind of fun. And Tim is a musician, so he has all this recording equipment in his house. And so I said, Tim, let's just record. We could do a podcast. It's really simple, right? We just record it and we push it out there to the world.
Hey, how difficult can this be?
I mean, come on. It's a microphone, or you plug it into your computer. Boom, 30 minutes later, you're done. You just publish it. What more? We can do this every month with our speakers. And
the thing is, Kurt was right. For him, it was really super easy.
So in the long run, what ended up happening is we had so much fun doing that with James. And all of a sudden we realized, if we're only going to do this once a month with the speakers we get for people coming to Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we're not paying people to fly into Minneapolis, Minnesota to speak to 25, 30 people, there has to be a different way. And the podcast was this opportunity for us to say, wow, we know people in India. We have connections around the United States. We know people in England and around Europe. So how can we get them? We can actually record them, via technology today and have them be part of this podcast. And we can get that out to the world so that we can expand this community beyond Minneapolis, and we can expand it into the larger thing. So that's which I love that it was really such a simple little nugget that got us going. And I think we were just thinking, I think both of us were thinking, gosh, if we could just get this community going, this community meetup here in Minneapolis. And the ironic thing is now I think of all of our listeners, only about 60% are from the U.S., that we have a large portion of our listeners that are outside the U.S., mostly in the UK, Australia, and India. But we have listeners in more than 100 countries now, and
that was sort of unanticipated. But I will add to Kurt's founding story by saying we were quickly just going through names, and Behavioral Grooves just stuck. We thought, oh, this is a cool name, and so Kurt's working on the logo, and he's got a team member who's helping out on the logo, and we're working on it. And I said, so this is going to be great. So every one of our interviews, we'll be able to talk about music. And Kurt says, why would we do that? I was like, well, it's behavioral grooves. And he said, yeah, like, the grooves in our brain and our habits and the routines that we create. And I like, no, I thought you were talking about grooves, like in grooving, like the groove of a song.
Well, I have to admit, our logo actually looks like a record player. The G is structured such that it looks like a record player. So I give it. And I give Tim a bunch of grief on the show. If you listen to the show, there's this kind of back and forth between Tim and I about music. And, oh, my gosh, we have to talk about music again, don't we, Tim? And all these kind of things. But in reality, I have come around. Tim has converted me. And what I find...
I didn't have to convert you. You've always loved music. I
have always loved music. But as part of the podcast, what I love about it is when you start talking music, it opens up a different perspective for people, and they open up in different ways than they would just telling about the research or telling about the work that they do in applying behavioral science in their jobs. So it gives a different perspective in on this human that we're interviewing. And oftentimes some of the most insightful pieces of information we get are when we're talking about how they what's on their playlist, or how they use music as part in when they're working or not. And we have some great discussions with people about, the songs and the meaning of those songs. And so it opens up a whole new window to people's personality and their likes. So,
and some of it's just fun. I mean, to think that Melina Palmer sang the national anthem for a national baseball game, that Caroline Webb actually sings in a choir that performs twice a year at Carnegie Hall in New York City.
Or like Kuhn Smets, who's, I know Christian, right? He's a jazz musician, and and he's talking about the altered chord? Was that part of it?
Yeah. So, but it's fascinating because I love it because it brings a human aspect to the conversation, and as you say, it's disarming, because I have a sneaking suspicion when they come on, people are a little bit kind of, I will be judged now, and I will be put into so you are basically human Spotify algorithms, and you're kind of going, okay, I know what we're dealing with here. We can pigeonhole these people as to whatever, but you get some really interesting insights. And I think the other bit that it always highlights for me is every single time people come up with something slightly different. So we don't have many repeat performances. And I think if you just turn up on your show and you just said, I like the Beatles, which I've deliberately chosen for reasons that we know. And if you don't know, my listeners, have a listen to their show. You'll find out one of them has views on the Beatles. But it's you can't get away with that sort of entry level stuff. You have to have something that's a little bit more engaging. And I think you really do pull some sort of fascinating threads out of people by taking them off topic and kind of throwing them off guard slightly and letting them be themselves.
Yeah, that would be episode 86, by the way, if you want to listen to Christian Hunt. Episode 86. Yeah.
No, but I think, Christian, you bring up a really interesting part, and hopefully the humanizing of this, because Tim can go down into the weeds. He can talk about, the drummer from Matahoopel in 1974 was this, and I'm sitting there going, where the hell is that information stored in your brain? Because there's no way that I could ever do that, and so I try to make it so those people who, may just like the Rolling Stones or may just like the Beatles or one of those other bands.
Or just have a Spotify playlist that's called Chill Out.
Yeah, those are the people that I like. I get that. I understand those people. That's me. And I don't have to talk about, how you alter chords in a jazz thing and compare that to, Chopin's, fifth concerto and whatever Tim can go off on. And but it's fun. It is really fun. And, it's a part of this idea that behavioral science reaches beyond just the research that we do. And actually behavioral science can be part of it becomes part of our world in the jobs that we do and the interactions we have with people, in the music that we listen to, in every aspect of it, you can take a behavioral science lens, and it can add some flavor and it can add some insight that you wouldn't get otherwise.
Love it. And the final thing I want to pick up, you're about to do something new and have weekly grooves. I notice you've committed to on your podcast. Can you tell us about that? When is that launching? Because I sensed in the last time you were talking that it was sort of, you're going to do it if you can get around to doing it. So I'm gonna get you commit. This is a commitment device. It's going to make this happen.
What's
the idea there?
So the idea there is that we are going to do. So as part of our the Behavioral Grooves podcast that we do, we do the long form interview, kind of like what we're doing here. And then after each of those interviews, Tim and I do a grooving session where we groove on what we just heard. We bring in our own insights, our own thoughts, our own kind of aspects of what we think is important. And sometimes we go deep, sometimes we go wide. Depends on what that is. Weekly Grooves, which is our new podcast that is going to come out by the end of the month in January in 2020. So I don't know when this is going to be launched, but we will.
I am going to get this out before then so that your commitment is public, because as we know, public commitments are more powerful.
There we are. So Weekly Grooves is we're gonna groove on a topic of the week. And so we're going to pick either topical things because of a holiday or various different things. So we'll have some episodes on maybe, dating around, Valentine's Day. We'll have some things or, various different things there, or topics that are kind of in the news. And we might take some things or just general topics and kind of try and apply them to everyday life. No interviews. We're going to be just grooving on it, bringing some research aspects in, trying to make it so that's really actionable for people in 10, 15 minutes.
So it's still for people who are interested in the behavioral science stuff. There is still that, but it's going to be a little more condensed and a little more focused in the conversation. And it will just be a single topic every week. And I don't know if I would say that we're not going to go down rabbit holes, because that's just not us. But I think we'll go down fewer rabbit holes.
I thought you said we weren't going down rabbit holes, Tim, and I was going to say, wait, that's I don't know what universe you're living in, because that's not.
I don't think we won't commit to no rabbit holes. That
would be a dangerous commitment. Yeah,
absolutely.
No, we will.
Damn you, Christian Hunt.
We will commit to the end of the month. We have we're recording the first episode actually tomorrow. We have a second episode in the works, so we're getting there. We're on the path.
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, I've now, of course, committed to get this out by the end of January. So I have committed you and committed myself, which feels like a nice bit of sort of lockstep commitment.
Thank you.
Listen, thank you so much for appearing. Before I let you go, how can people find you, both in terms of your podcasts, but also you as professional individuals, if they like some of the ideas that you were talking about earlier on?
So Behavioral Grooves podcast can be found in virtually any system or podcatcher that you're using. If you're using Apple or Spotify or any kind of thing, Behavioral Grooves is the way to find us. Or you can go to our website, behavioralgrooves.com, which is pretty terrific, because we've got transcripts and show notes and things like that there as well.
But it's spelt without the U. So for all those English listeners, it's behavioral without the U.
Without the U, that's true. And then Kurt and I, while we do work together a pretty fair amount, we also have our own individual consultancies. And my consultancy is called Behavior Alchemy. It's one word, Behavior Alchemy. Again, no U. And you can check out the kinds of behavioral interventions and case studies and things like that I do in my consultancy there. Kurt?
Yeah, and my company is the Lantern Group. So again, lanterngroup.com. You can go out and check that. You can also look for me, Kurt W. Nelson, on LinkedIn or Twitter at What Motivates. Tim is at T. Houlihan on Twitter, and I think Tim Houlihan on LinkedIn. So we love talking with people. If you have any questions, we're happy to chat. This is kind of a passion, as you understand, Christian. So you get us talking, and we could go on and on and on and on. So
And as you have demonstrated on this call, great fun people to chat to. The podcast is highly recommended, and do follow them on social media as well, because there's some fascinating insights they pick up. I find one of the great things about this community is that people do the work for me. So I just follow some cool people who do all the ferreting around and the. So my favorite kind of heuristic is find some good people to follow on social media and let them do all the hard work, and then just bask in the glory of retweeting them. And you two are absolutely on.
You're brilliant.
Thank you.
You're absolutely brilliant.
Thank you so much for appearing. I really appreciate it.
Our pleasure. This is so much fun. Thanks so much, Christian.
Thank you.
That's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast, and my massive thanks to Kurt and to Tim for appearing and being such entertaining and informative guests. Now, as they mentioned, if you want to find the Behavioural Grooves podcast, it's available wherever you get your high-quality audio content. The same is true for this, the Human Risk Podcast, so please do go ahead and subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. That way you'll get the latest episodes as soon as they're released. It would also be extremely helpful if you could leave a review on whichever podcasting platform you use. That enables me to raise the profile of the show and to continue to get the kind of high quality guests that we've managed to have so far. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you very soon on another episode of the Human Risk Podcast.